Hey everyone, and thanks for taking the time to check out this video. SKS fans, this is a big one. The subject of today's video is without a doubt the coolest variant I have ever brought to this channel, and I cannot overstate how excited I am to be able to make this presentation. If you would have bumped into me on the street anytime in the past several years and asked Triangle if you could make a video on any firearm ever, I would have cut you off and said, way ahead of you, pre-production Type 56 carbine, aka the real Sino-Soviet. As far as I'm concerned, this is the single most important SKS variant in history, and ultimately the reason we remember the SKS today. It's the earliest known artifact of SKS production in China, and essentially a hand receipt for one of the most consequential small arms transfers of the 20th century. The problem is, this extremely rare SKS pattern carbine is virtually impossible to find. In fact, by any definition, it's among the rarest documented production variants on the US collector market. No one knows for sure exactly how many examples are out there, but considering that less than 20 are publicly documented, it's probably safe to assume you could fit the entire national supply in the backseat of a Ford Fiesta with room to spare. Even for the most serious collectors, the real challenge in acquiring one of these isn't budgeting for one, it's simply finding one for sale. And yet, under circumstances I will detail later in this video, I recently acquired a genuine pre-production Type 56 carbine. It's not a perfect specimen, but it is the real deal, so of course, for the first time in a video format, we're going to make a video on it. As usual, we'll talk about identification criteria, historical context, impact, collector considerations, and hopefully anything else you might want to know. We're going to take a very close hands-on look at my example, and yes, we're going to put a few rounds through it as well. Oh, and by the way, I wasn't kidding about this being the first time a pre-production Type 56 carbine has ever been featured in a video. I was only able to acquire this through the momentum of the channel, so if I earn your viewership today, please consider doing the YouTube stuff like, comment, subscribe. Our tech overlords hate firearm and military history content, but not as much as they love clicks. So if these subjects are part of what keeps bringing you back to this site, do us both a favor and let YouTube know. Without further ado, let's just get right into it. Right off the bat, let's define which variant we're actually talking about today, and that requires us to break down a little terminology. I'll keep it brief. The term I'm going to be using today is pre-production Type 56 carbine. However, it's important for viewers to understand that I made that term up. The reason I'm using a made-up term is because there really isn't a well-established label for this variant. Most people who know of it refer to it as the Sino-Soviet or Soviet-Sino. However, as I've detailed on this channel before, those terms are also in common use to describe at least a half dozen other variants, and consequently, they're more confusing than useful. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go ahead and just plug the search term Sino-Soviet SKS into your search engine of choice and have fun trying to sort through the results. You will see that term applied to the so-called letter series, the ghost rifles, Russian sneaks, and literally any Type 56 carbine manufactured prior to a certain date, with 1961 and 1964 being two popular cutoffs. And for whatever it's worth, I actually have a whole video about why none of those definitions are technically wrong. The term Sino-Soviet literally just means Chinese-Russian, and given that the entire Type 56 carbine lineage demonstrates varying degrees of blended Chinese and Russian properties, I'm not going to make an argument that the term Sino-Soviet can only be applied to one hyper-specific variant. You don't need to be an SKS autist to understand that's a recipe for confusion. Anyway, the takeaway for this video is that while many of you will likely know the variant I'm talking about today only as the Sino-Soviet, many others will already associate that term with a host of completely different variants. I'm using a novel term today in an attempt to bypass that confusion. So what is a pre-production Type 56 carbine? Well, as long as I was making up my own term, I tried to at least make it self-explanatory. It's exactly what it sounds like. There's always a level of uncertainty when dealing with Chinese weapons, and later I'll speak to that in detail, but for now, here's what we think we know. The pre-production Type 56 carbine is an example of the very first SKS pattern carbines ever assembled in China prior to the initiation of the first production run. They feature 100% or very nearly 100% Soviet-made parts and were specifically assembled for the purpose of training assembly line technicians at State Arsenal 296, also known as Triangle 26. So let's briefly set the scene. In 1953, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin died and was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev reversed Stalin's policy of withholding modern military technology from interested communist nations and began en masse approvals of outstanding technology transfer requests. One such request was for the SKS-45 on behalf of the People's Republic of China, and this got the green light on January 11, 1955. The Chinese Central Military Commission selected State Arsenal 296 to receive that technology transfer, and by the end of that month, 296 was already moving at full gear. They began upgrading their facilities, developing new procedures, and among other things, training hundreds of workers in the Russian language. The USSR began delivering technical data in August of 1955, followed shortly by tooling, advisors, and spare parts. The Chinese had fully organized this data by October of that year, and by January of 1956, the production and assembly lines were fully staged and ready to begin training. And this is where we need to pay more careful attention. When we think of manufacturing firearms, it's natural to focus on machining, but that's only half the battle. Once the parts are actually made, they still need to be inspected, marked, and properly assembled, and that's where assembly lines come in. Remember how I said the Soviet technology transfer package included spare parts? Well, we know from the Chinese reports that these actually consisted of 3,000 complete parts kits, and the reason they were provided was to accommodate concurrent training of the production and assembly lines. That makes a lot of sense. In absence of these parts kits, assembly line technicians would not be able to start their hands-on training until the production line was capable of producing finished parts. This is obviously inefficient because it means the assembly line would have nothing to do while the production line was training, and as soon as the production line got up to speed, they would have to grind back to a halt while the assembly line learned their roles. This bottleneck was avoided by allowing the assembly line to practice on pre-made Soviet parts kits, so by the time the first domestically manufactured parts started rolling down the line, the assembly techs already knew exactly what to do with them. That's what we're talking about when we say pre-production Type 56 carbine. These would be the very first Type 56 carbines ever assembled in China, built during pre-production job training from Soviet-made components which were included in the original technology transfer package. So, everything I've told you up until this point is more or less factual. We have documentation. This is how Type 56 carbine production began in China. We know those Soviet part kits existed, and we know what they were used for. Where things start to get a little more speculative is actually connecting the dots between that historical documentation and physical specimens today. The documentation does not tell us exactly how these rifles were marked or what happened to them after assembly. Additionally, it is unclear just how many of those 3,000 parts kits were actually assembled. There's no two ways about it. In order to identify them today, we need to make inferences and educated guesses. That said, as we explore the peculiarities of this particular carbine, I think you will likely come to the same conclusion that myself and many others have. The evidence for this being just such a pre-production Type 56 carbine is not just strong, it's overwhelming. And that segues us nicely into the identification section. When identifying a pre-production Type 56 carbine, at the most basic level, we're looking for something which occupies the mechanical footprint of a late pattern Tula SKS 45. This is what we see from the few other collectors who have documented these things, and it's exactly what we would expect from a rifle which was quite literally assembled from late pattern Tula parts kits. In theory, that means blade bayonet, long lug threaded barrel interface, bottom sling swivel, lightning cuts in appropriate locations, milled trigger housing, all the usual suspects. In practice, it's important to remember that many Chinese rifles have been subject to varying degrees of military, commercial, and end-user refurbishment, so it's certainly possible for some features to have been changed or replaced over the past 70-odd years. Obviously, some of those adjustments are much more likely than others, but they all require nothing more than a trained eye and a little context to recognize. Beyond that, we are looking for 4 of 4 additional features, and this is really where the rubber meets the road. First, we need to see a 5-pointed Tula star on the left sidewall of the receiver above the wood line. This indicates that the receiver was manufactured at Tula Arsenal in or after 1955. Second, we need to see a 4-digit numeric serial number with no alphabetical prefixes or suffixes. This is of critical importance because it's one of the main ways we distinguish these from simply being normal production Soviet SKS 45s. Additionally, please note that the current known serial number range for pre-production appears to be 0001 through 2000. Some evidence suggests that these production numbers run sequentially with the first production run, and while conventional wisdom has placed that transition at rifle 2001, it may have occurred as late as rifle 2250. Either way, the highest theoretical production number should be 3,000, although under 2250 is more realistic and under 2,000 is most probable. Third, we need to see some type of evidence that the rifle came from China. The most obvious form this evidence could take would be an import stamp. However, other forms of evidence do exist. For example, we know that the Chinese commercial overhaul process could be applied to literally any Type 56 carbine. If, for example, we observe a so-called paratrooper configuration, which otherwise fits the requirements, and indeed several of those do seem to exist, that itself would be interpreted as strong evidence that the rifle was exported from China. They're the only country we know who cut down military rifles for commercial export purposes. Fourth and finally, we need to see a very high volume of inspection and assembly marks, more consistent with Soviet production than Chinese production. This is another fairly obvious feature considering we believe these rifles were quite literally used to train assembly line technicians. At that time, they would have been adhering to the strictest Soviet inspection procedures and would not yet have incorporated the distinctly Chinese streamlining for which they would later become known. We'll circle back to this, but for now the takeaway is that we're looking for inspection marks on essentially every single component, including components that were not marked for the overwhelming majority of Chinese production, such as gas blocks. Additionally, we're looking for very high concentrations of inspection marks in critical areas, such as the bolt, receiver, and barrel interface. And that's pretty much it, guys. These things aren't particularly hard to identify, they're just hard to find. Now that we know what we're looking at, let's circle back to the million-dollar question. How can we connect that specific and observable feature set to the historically documented pre-production Type 56 carbine variant? Well, I know I've already drawn a few connections, but let's really spell it out now. Even if we've never heard of the pre-production Type 56 carbine, the features of this rifle point us in a very specific direction. At first, we see a late pattern Tula SKS 45. That's easy enough. Unfortunately, the serial number is not at all consistent with Soviet production. When was the last time you saw a Soviet serial number with no alphabetical prefix and a numeric string beginning with a 0? Trick question, you didn't see that because that's not how Russians mark their weapons. Who does mark their weapons that way? The Chinese. And guess what? It turns out this rifle was indeed exported from China. We're starting to zero in now. If we infer that the rifle was serialized in China, as evidenced by its distinct format and import status, it's also reasonable to infer that it was inspected and assembled in China. Generally, those processes go hand in hand. So now we look at inspection assembly marks, and what do we see? Literally dozens of them. Where else in Chinese history do we see this volume of inspection marks? Well, technically, we never do. The closest we ever get is the 1956 first production run Ghost rifles. That volume steadily decreases by 1958 and even further by 1960 and is virtually non-existent for the next couple decades. Occasionally we'll see a marginal uptick from lesser known factories in the 1970s, but never even close to what we saw in the 50s. In other words, we have a very clear trend here, and the only place this rifle would logically fit into that trend line is at the very beginning. That means spring of 1956. So does it really fit the bill? Well, ultimately that's up for you to decide, but friends of my channel know that I'm not afraid to say when something just isn't adding up, or I know that I don't know, and I'm not sure that's the case here. If we start with the historical documentation of pre-production Type 56 carbines and infer what they must have looked like, we end up looking for Soviet parts kits inspected, assembled, and exported from China with distinctly Chinese serial numbers that are most likely to fall within the 1 to 3,000 range. If instead we start by inspecting the features of this extremely rare, yet very real production anomaly, and pretend we didn't just absolutely drill the search criteria from that last thought experiment, our search will still lead us to China in the spring of 1956. So can we say with 100% certainty that this is one of those pre-production Type 56 carbines? No, I don't think we can. But we can say the likelihood is overwhelming, and that is a very safe working hypothesis unless or until we're confronted with a theory bearing equal or greater evidence. And as of now, no such theory exists. So before we move on, let's just take a moment to at the very least pretend this is what I'm proposing it to be and say a few words about what that means. I get it. Not everyone sees SKS patterns or curio and relic firearms the way I do. Not everyone gets a dopamine hit from spending a significant fraction of their waking life studying the subtle differences between rifles that all essentially function the same way. That's fine. But whoever you are, I hope you can appreciate that this rifle changed the world. In the spring of 1956, the SKS pattern carbine was an anachronism on the fast track to early retirement. It was brilliant in its elegant simplicity, but it was simply a day late and $1 short for Soviet service. Any rational person would have expected Mikhail Kalashnikov's 1947 design to be the first and last nail in the SKS's coffin. The fact that it wasn't represents one of the most improbable plot twists in the history of small arms, and that's a fact. The thing is, the Chinese saw something in the SKS that the Russians never did. They correctly predicted that the SKS design would thrive in the irregular guerrilla warfare environments that would ravage Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe throughout the second half of the 20th century. They turned what should have been a historical footnote into one of the most produced weapon systems in human history, and for better or for worse, they allowed it to place its indelible mark on individuals, families, and nations the world over. My channel keeps coming back to the SKS because the story of the SKS transcends time and place. It transports us to the jungles of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. It takes us to the mountains of Bosnia, the streets of Lebanon, and even the Rhodesian bush. It gives a voice to millions of dead, it immortalizes the best and worst of us, and it reminds us that we are not the first to play this game called life. It's not always a happy story, but it is an important one, and it all comes back to this rifle. If it hadn't been for Nikita Khrushchev, 3,000 Soviet parts kits, and a Chinese gamble on an unlikely workhorse, many of the stories we tell today would be very different. That's important to understand. So now that we've talked about historical context, identification, and impact, let's take a closer look at my example before we move into collector considerations. First up, I know that some people will just want to know how the heck I actually got my hands on one of these things, so let's tell that story. A few weeks back, I got an email from a viewer. He had recently come into a few firearms, including a Chinese SKS, which he planned to sell. This guy was sharp enough to do his research before listing it, and after watching a few of my videos, he realized what he had and reached out to me to confirm the ID. Long story short, we ended up getting on the phone so I could walk him through a part-by-part inspection, and I shared a few tips about navigating the seller's market, as he was already in communication with a few auction houses. Anyway, much to my delight, this guy throws out an idea which is just music to my ears, which is that, you know what, it might actually make sense for both of us if he just sold it to me. He got to bypass the hassle of a third-party sale, and I got to bring a grail gun to my collection, and therefore to all of you. We negotiated a price, I got him my FFL information and a very healthy check, and here we are today. In other words, the channel came through, guys. If it wasn't for my videos, your viewership, and one really cool guy from the Midwest, I'd be making a video about 40 Smith & Wesson versus 9mm right now. And just because I know he's watching, one more big thank you to the seller. You were an absolute professional to work with. I appreciate you, and I know that many others in the SKS world do as well, because you didn't just sell the rifle to me, you sold it to them. And yeah, I know that's easy for me to say when I'm the guy who gets to look at it on my wall every night, but at least with me, anyone with an internet connection will be able to see it, appreciate it, and use it as a reference. Speaking of referencing, let's look a little closer now. Obviously, my example is number 443, and yes, I do believe that most likely means this is the 443rd SKS ever assembled in China out of a total production exceeding 10 million. That's pretty wild. Also, some viewers may have noted that I chose against obscuring any part of my serial number in this video. Normally that would be my preference, but in this case, I think it would have meaningfully detracted from the presentation. So, feast your eyes, I guess. Otherwise, like I said from the beginning, my example is far from perfect. It's perfect to me, but I did have to do some work on it, and there is some more to do. So let's break down what I mean by that. First up, the stock. When I received this rifle, it was in a very clearly non-matching stock, as evidenced by the presence of 2 non-matching serial numbers and a period-incorrect side-mounted sling swivel. In order to create a more complete presentation aesthetic, I refurbished an orphaned Arctic birch stock into a facsimile of the original. I do believe this is the most likely wood type to have been included with the original parts kit, and as you can see, I did stamp a reproduction serial number using period-correct 6mm stamps. And before anyone accuses me of fakery, I urge you to take a step back and remember why fakes are bad in the first place. Fakes are bad because people pass them off as authentic and take advantage of buyers. I'm doing neither of those things. I'm simply decorating my own property in the way that I think best honors its historical significance for the enjoyment of myself and viewers. I have no plans to sell this rifle. However, if it is eventually sold by myself or my estate, it will come with very clear records, not to mention that most prospective buyers will have watched this video. Anyway, the takeaway is that while this stock is a loose reproduction, it is not correct. Also, you may note that the sling swivel and butt plate have Soviet refurbishment paint on them, which would also not be correct. We believe the original components were transferred to China in new condition and would therefore have been blued. The handguard actually is correct, or is at least internally stamped to match. However, it has been refinished several times. Next, it should be noted that a previous owner has clearly polished the receiver cover and bolt carrier. Unfortunately, that's something that used to happen to SKSs pretty regularly. The original owner probably paid $79 for this and treated it accordingly. So while these components are original to the rifle, they are not correct in terms of their surface finish. I am considering rebluing the receiver cover. We'll see if I get around to that. Next up, a previous owner inexplicably cut off the exposed portion of the lock pin from the receiver cover takedown pin in order to make it non-captive. This is pretty dumb, by the way. If there's one thing you should know about the SKS design, it's that pretty much every cubic millimeter is there for a very good reason, sometimes multiple good reasons. In any case, I ended up just fabricating a replacement lock pin from a roofing nail, press fitted into place, and everything works normally again. Pretty subtle, but worth pointing out. Speaking of roofing nails, the trigger guard latch pin was missing for some reason, so I replaced that with a roofing nail as well. Roofing nails are great, guys. I haven't bought an actual pin in like 12 years. And finally, the rear sight leaf spring was damaged from improper installation, and I did replace that with a 1958 production Type 56 carbine spring. I would have used any spring, that's just what I happen to have lying around. I will say part of me wondered if the improper installation of the original leaf spring might originate with a Chinese technician performing that process for the very first time. However, I think that's a bit of a stretch. Given the butchery that took place on the receiver cover lock pin, I think the most likely explanation is that a previous owner at one point removed the rear sight assembly in order to install a rear-mounted peep sight and improperly installed the leaf spring when returning it to its original configuration. Other than that, all parts appear to be original and correct, as evidenced by non-force match serial numbers and inspection marks on components that would not normally be marked. So let's answer the real question, shall we? How does it shoot? Well, for better or for worse, that's probably the most boring part of this video. It's an SKS. It shoots like any other SKS. I will say it does feel a little sloppy compared to some of the late Soviet or early Chinese examples made around that same time. Those are some of my favorites, but whether or not that has anything to do with its provenance as a pre-production assembly is highly speculative. In order to draw a conclusion like that, I think someone would need to handle more examples than we're even sure exist, so not sure if we're ever going to get clear data on that. Also, anytime I talk about relative SKS performance, I'm talking about pretty darn subtle differences. I've shot a lot of Type 56 and commercial conventional carbines in my life, and while there are absolutely differences worth noting, I've made tons of videos on that subject, the maximum spread between the best and the worst is really pretty marginal. It's an extremely consistent weapon. I will say I didn't get to put quite as many rounds to this example as I had planned for, as unfortunately I did not identify the rear sight defect until I was at the range. You can actually see me discovering that in this clip. I felt like my elevation was wandering, and sure enough, the rear sight was adjusting under recoil. The range I was at has a relatively small berm, and I just determined that wasn't a safe combination. It also really didn't help that I was out for an annual Memorial Day shoot with a good buddy of mine, and I had a lot of really cool firearms out there. And I bet you're thinking Triangle 26, probably pretty hard to compete with getting the opportunity to shoot a pre-production Type 56 carbine for the first time. But as I've said in this channel before, PSLs are also a whole lot of fun. Either way, the weapon does work just fine, and while I don't plan to put too many rounds through it, I absolutely do intend to break it out a few times a year, and of course, I'll try to put it in the hands of as many fellow SKS enthusiasts as I possibly can. Part of me is honestly quite glad I ended up with a rough example, because I think if it were really nice, I would feel compelled to baby it, and that's just not how I prefer to interact with firearms. It's a good thing I'm not a stamp collector, because I'd probably lick every stamp in my collection, so it's a good thing I'm a gun collector and I just shoot them. With that out of the way, let's talk collector considerations. Normally, this is the part of the video where I say, so, should you get one of these things? But unfortunately, that doesn't really apply here. So let's take it in a different direction. I think the most important thing to understand about this variant from a collector perspective is that while there are very few documented examples in circulation, there are almost certainly a few more which have yet to be identified, and that's pretty exciting. This example was imported into the United States in the 1980s, and it took 4 decades for someone to recognize it was different from the rifles it was imported alongside. Again, shout out to the seller. He figured out something that a lot of people missed. So here's the question. What do you think the odds are that that was the last unidentified pre-production in circulation? I don't know about you, but I've got that somewhere approximating 0%. The way I see it, there have to be at least a dozen of these, if not more, gathering dust in closets all around the country. One of my goals for this channel is to play some small part in fostering curiosity about these weapons and help new generations of owners see these less as cheap Chinese toys and more as potent artifacts of 20th century warfare, each of which carry their own story. So will we see more of these in coming years? Yes, I think we probably will. Unfortunately, we know the total number is pretty limited, and most of them have probably been destroyed, refurbished, they're actively seeing use in low-intensity conflicts, or they might even be hanging on the wall of high-ranking CCP affiliates. Who really knows? The point is, I don't think I'm going to be the last person to have one of these fall in my lap, and I hope this video helps the next person. So let's say you do come across one of these. The first question a lot of people will ask is, what's it worth? That's a fair question, but a tricky one, so I'll tell you exactly what I told the seller of this rifle when he reached out to me. The truth is, nobody knows. Every YouTube commenter is capable of turning out their own opinion, but opinions are free. Prices are determined by what someone is actually willing to pay, and these just don't sell enough for us to know where that line really is. Obviously, I know what I was willing to pay, but I'm not going to share that number in this video because I don't see how that helps anyone. Some people would immediately say I set the bar way too high and accuse me of inflating the market, and other people would claim that they would have easily outbid me. Both of those things might technically be true, but neither of them is going to change what actually happened. I'd be happy to provide more information to someone who actually has the opportunity to buy or sell one of these things, but otherwise, I don't see how it's relevant today. Here's what I will say. Based on current information, the pre-production Type 56 carbine is understood to be significantly more rare than the East German, North Korean, and North Vietnamese SKS, commonly called the Big Three. These days, those rifles tend to command auction prices starting at around $2,500 and sometimes exceeding $10,000. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're a fair comparison point, and it certainly doesn't mean that this would be likely to outsell such examples. Although there may be a higher supply of the Big Three, there's also a much greater demand. Due to the circumstances under which those particular variants entered the United States, all three will draw in the Vietnam War crowd, not just SKS-specific collectors. Furthermore, the East German variant, which by the way is the one that consistently sets the high end of that earlier value proposition, appeals to yet another market, which is the German collector crowd. The Vietnam War and German collector markets are some of the most competitive out there, and they draw in heavyweight buyers from well outside the SKS collecting sphere. To many of those people, a Chinese SKS is just another Chinese SKS, regardless of what story comes with it. Obviously, I don't share that perspective, but I recognize that it's still a reality for some. With all that in mind, I would personally expect a pre-production Type 56 carbine to sell at public auction for somewhere in the low end of that Big Three range, and a rough example like mine might have trouble even getting that high. On the other hand, anytime someone is selling something this hard to find, and prospective buyers know that it might well be their only opportunity to get it, it really doesn't take many interested parties to drive the price through the roof. If one of these is ever publicly auctioned, I'll be watching with as much curiosity as anyone else, and I could absolutely see one going for significantly more or significantly less than what I paid for mine. Like I said at the beginning, however, if you really do want to get one of these, unfortunately, budgeting is the least of your problems. The hard part is still just finding one for sale. And that's the video, guys. This is absolutely not the last time this rifle will appear on the channel, but we are going to wrap up for today. Once again, if you appreciate content like this, it really does make a big difference for me if you could do any combination of hitting like, comment, and subscribe. This video was only possible due to the momentum this channel has received over the past year, and who knows what else is possible if that momentum continues to grow. Additionally, at risk of beating a dead horse, YouTube really does hate firearm content, but not as much as they love clicks. So if you appreciate being able to watch educational presentations on military and firearm history, it really is in your interest to let YouTube know that's why you're here. Again, the only language YouTube speaks is clicks. So if that's you, hit those buttons on my channel and any other channel you like. Finally, if you're new to this channel and like what we're doing, I encourage you to check out my SKS playlist. Tons of good information in there, and I'm adding to it all the time. Should be somewhere on your screen now. I also make videos on other historical and modern firearms, night vision equipment, and really anything that holds my attention. So if you're interested in that, just check out my channel. Thanks again for taking time to check out this video, guys, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.